Today I'm going to walk through how to create a mountain range. Right from drawing the line art to doing the shading, to doing some details, and then getting into how to do the colouring at the end. So the first thing to do is create a new layer. We always do lines on new layers. And then I'm going to pick a hard round brush and set it to be pressure sensitive. So when I press harder it gives a thicker line, and when it's less hard it'll be a thinner line. This is a nice kind of ink-like line. So first up, draw in the actual ridgeline itself. So this is, rather than treating a mountain range as individual mountains, we're going to treat the ridge, the whole range, as its kind of own thing. And then what you do is you take from the individual peaks in that ridgeline, you draw the lines off the side to kind of define the individual mountains within it. So this will give us a nice, big, formidable mountain range, like the Misty Mountains or something similar. Just a quick note whilst I'm sketching in this, there's a tutorial on how to do this part kicking around already. So I'm going to just bang this in quickly because I want to focus more on the shading in this tutorial. The background you see is a parchment texture, and it's kind of a mid-tone. And the reason for this is it allows us to both do shadows, making it darker, but then also pull out highlights as well. If we just did a white background, we would have to work in from the lightest all the way to the darkest. So this gives us the ability to both lighten and darken the mountain range, which is actually super handy. Okay, let me just finish this off quickly and then we'll get onto the shading piece. If you want to pick up your own parchment texture, there's lots of them out there on the web. You can go and do a quick kind of aged paper background search or something similar, or you can go to Fantastic Maps and there are some paper textures there that you can pull from. The key with the line art at this stage is just to make it nice and detailed, right? You don't actually have to make it look precisely right, but just the suggestion of texture. So a lot of these lines you'll see don't line up, don't join up with things, but it gives us the impression later on of detail. So now create a new layer, and we're going to put the lighting on this one. And I'm going to have the light coming from the top left. So the left-hand side, this side here, will be the light side, and then on the far side, that's going to be in shadow. So it's always good just to get a clear idea of where you're going to put the light and shade. So I'm picking a new layer here, and I'm setting I'm going to call it the light and shade layer, and I'm going to set the blend mode to overlay. Okay, now in this case I'm going to take a hard round brush. So rather than setting the pressure sensitivity to change the size of it, I'm now using pressure sensitivity to set the darkness. So press hard, you get a nice big black. But if you press a little lighter, you see there's some variation. Now that's still a bit too dark all the time. So I'm actually going to set this so that the pressure sensitivity has been turned up a little. Right? So it's setting the pressure sensitivity so that it's now nice and sensitive. Here we go. So a little light press gives us a very light grey line. Dark gets us to like full black, but the size doesn't change. So now change this from a normal blend mode to overlay. And this means that there's now black will have a different effect. So if I now press, you see rather than getting that hard black, we get this nice rich brown. And the first thing to do here is just block in the general shadow, right? We're not trying to do anything particularly subtle. We're just trying to start very quickly putting in a light shade across the entire far side of the mountain range. I'm not trying to color into any corners, or I'm not trying to get to anywhere close to a finished shadow. I just want to block in the biggest form. So start with the biggest brush, but the lightest touch, and start to color in this so we get a nice kind of even shadow on the far side. So it starts to give us some form to these mountains. And the key thing here is that you don't want to go too dark too fast, so you can build up layers and layers and layers, right? And I'm also now coloring in tighter into the tops, because at the top of a mountain range, that's where the mountains are steepest, and so the shadows are going to be the deepest. So you want the darkest shadows to be up near the top of the mountain range, and then it kind of smoothly fades out as you get to the plains. And that means your mountain range is actually going to look like it integrates into the map that you're drawing, rather than just like being stark. Now we also want some shadow on the leading edge, because even though it's towards the sunlight, we have lots of ridges and lines and texture and detail there. So those themselves are going to throw their own shadows. Those shadows will be less stark than the fully shaded side, but just pretty much on the right hand side of every line we want a little bit of shadow just to try and pull that detail apart. Okay, now you see I'm using a much smaller brush than I did when I started out. It was really, really big to begin with and now we're down to a much smaller size. And so that's allowing me to go into some of the key details here. I've also now increased the opacity of the brush so that I can actually go and really lay in some actual dark shadows along the top. So you can see that's starting to pick out the detail. Now I'm putting the darkest pieces right alongside some of the lines that I put in when I was sketching. And what this does is it kind of doubles down on the detail that we started off with. It really sells the fact that those are like sharp, clean, hard edges. And really starts to pull its mountain range out of the paper. It's always worth going back to reference for this. So if you go and just go into a Google Maps search for some nice spiky mountains like the Alps or the Andes, particularly those cases where the mountains are covered in snow, you'll see very, very sharp, clean shadows along the top, which is a good way to see how these shadows are likely to fall. Okay, this is starting to come together quite nicely. But it always takes a little bit of time just to go through these pieces in, and a little bit of care at this stage definitely works. Now you could leave it at this stage, and if you're doing kind of a Lord of the Rings style parchment-based map, that actually works quite nicely at this point, but I tend to like to add an extra overlay layer. So this is basically the same layer, again, set the blend mode to overlay as before. We're still using a black brush color, but I'm now going back to the one where the shape of the brush is set to pressure sensitive as well. So a lighter touch will be a thinner line, a harder touch will be a thicker line. And this gives just a little bit more structure to this extra layer of detail we're about to do now. So once again, starting off with a dark brush and starting off with fairly low opacity, just starting to work into the details a bit more. The reason for this is it just adds layers, right? The more layers we add on top of it, the more granular your detail gets, the more it sells as being kind of this nice, rich, and detailed mountain range. There's kind of a general rule: the more just detail you throw at these kind of things, the better it looks when you're looking at the final map. You don't want to go too overboard, but there's definitely value here in going into these little extra crevasses and edges. We're basically just really banging up the contrast that we have here. Okay, so that's kind of coming along nicely. Once again, with this nice fine brush, we can actually go into some quite precise detail on the leading edge, so we can get a bit more texture and shading in there. When I'm doing this for a full map, rather than do each of these steps just for one individual mountain range, what I'll do is actually do the whole map in line art first, and then do the whole map with one layer of overlay layer to get the bulk lighted shaded. That's true not just for mountain ranges, but also your forests, your plains, your hills, your sea, all of that. So you basically have the equivalent level of detail across the entire map all at once. And then you go in and do the final layer of detailing across the entire map all at once. It just helps the whole thing hang together. Right, so now what I've done is I've switched over to set the brush to white. So you can see now that's actually bringing in light colors. It gives us some highlights. That allows us to actually pick the peaks of the mountain range out, right? So if you imagine that this was in a map with lots of plains and forests and all the rest of it, right, the leading edge at the moment is no lighter than the rest of the map, so it's going to look kind of flat. So this allows us to actually pull that out, like really highlight it, and that gives the mountain ranges like extra pop. And again, the brightest peaks are going to be at the top. They're the ones that are going to be the most pulled out. So the brightest points are the ridgeline itself. But as with the shadows, we don't keep the bright highlights just to the leading edge, right, the edge towards the light. You'll still see the light catching just the tops of those ridgelines on the far side as well. So this is why we're now pulling out just right along the ridgelines, right along the lines that I drew already, those individual highlights to kind of follow those and pick them out. This is starting to come together quite nicely. It looks a little messy. You can see I'm not being particularly careful about very precisely defining an edge or anything like that. But this is one of the joys of working digitally. So at this point, I'm 100% zoomed in and working at 100% view. When you print it, it's going to end up actually being a third of the size, right? And this is because your computer screen has 100 pixels per inch, more or less, something around there. Whereas print has 300 dots per inch, right? So print is a 3 times higher resolution. That means that within an inch you get 3 times more detail, right? So when I export any map, it'll end up being printed at 3 times the resolution that I work at. So what this really means is that this is much, much bigger than anybody would ever see it. So I worked on all the Game of Thrones maps at this kind of resolution, even though they're 3 times smaller in real life. So the nice thing to do is when you're actually working through this, you can go to Photoshop's option of View at Print Resolution, and you see that suddenly it looks like this, right? And when you zoom out, it's one of the great tricks of digital art is that suddenly all of those little details, which look a little messy close up, look really good when you zoom out. Okay, so this is starting to pull together kind of nicely, and you could leave it at this, right? If you were doing kind of a nice desaturated parchment style map, this is going to look really good. But generally you don't end up leaving it like that. We're going to go in and do some color as well, because what we want this to look like is a nice kind of stone-ridged mountain range. So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new layer. Always create a new layer. It's the easiest way to keep these things together. And we're going to set this one to a color blend mode. Right, now this is totally different from overlay, and it behaves a very different way. So we're going to pick a hard round brush, basically the same brush we were using at the beginning for our first coloring, for the first laying in the shadows to begin with. And we're going to set it to kind of a mid-grey. Right, beforehand we were just using black and white. Now I'm going to use a mid-grey for this. And the result of this is when you draw a line, right, instead of going dark, what it does is it just takes our kind of nice brown parchment background and turns it into a grey parchment background. And the harder you press, the closer it goes to that grey. Now if this were a mountain range in an Amazonian jungle, I would have gone for some kind of deep, rich green, right? If it was in the Arizona Badlands, I would have gone for something with a bit more red in it, right? But I just want to go with kind of a classic fantasy trope of mountains being these kind of grey stone monoliths. And so by doing this, we get to pull the color away from the general background parchment texture. So you can see here that just by using that very low opacity brush, I'm not pressing very hard, it's just starting to pick this out in its own grey. And I'm going quite carefully around the peak, so the central peak is going to be more grey than the bottom, so again the mountain range fades out into the background, there are no hard edges. And then I can reduce the brush tip size to really take the detail around the actual ridgeline itself. And this actually pulls the mountain range directly out of its surroundings and really defines the ridge itself. It's amazing how effective just a very little touch of colour can be. Now I'm going to go a bit deeper. I'm actually going to add some fairly saturated blue into the shadows. And this allows you to really pick out and define the cool shadows of your mountain range. Okay, with those shadows in place, and again I'm just going deeper into the darkest pieces to try and pick out some detail with the colour. But with that in place, that's basically this mountain range done, right? And you would do the same for any mountain range across the whole map step by step, just like this. And that's zoomed out to print resolution. And that's all for this time. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.